So first, I'm going to need a form so that both the proposer and the receiver can propose tokens to swap. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new form. And for ease of use, I'm going to clone one of my existing forms, transaction details, click save. Okay, so since we have cloned this form in here, I'm going to change up a few things. So first of all, we'll need to have the sender to define the token to swap. And we are going to load the data from our existing form data since we stored all the token data locally. So details, I'm going to use the token name for this. Now, since we are going to sort it by the sender, I'm also going to reference the token minter and scroll down. We should see the dependency. We can select the sender. And of course, we'll need one more field in here to define the amount. Alright, so once we have this, we can also change this slightly. And ensure that we have changed all the references accordingly. Okay, so this is just the very basic form of what we need in here. So I'll click save. Okay, so for our reference later on, we can also just generate a CRUD to quickly view this portion. So I'll generate the app first and generate a CRUD component. Okay, so now that we have that, we can come back to our App Studio, and this time we'll create the form that's meant for the receiver. And we'll just need to make a few more changes in here. So this time I am the receiver, so I could move it around. And for the receiver, we can come in here and put these fields as read-only since it has already been proposed by the sender. So now we just need to make a few more changes. So now that we have both sides of the forms, we can now save this form. And similarly, we can also generate a CRUD component for the receiver's end. Okay, so once we have done that, we can now come back to the App Studio, go to our process builder to create the process for both parties to swap tokens. And for our ease of configuration, I can also just copy one of these processes to send hbar. So my first step, I'm going to modify this process in here. I'm going to add in an activity so the receiver can interact before the token transfer happens. So since there will be two parties performing transfers, I can also copy two tools out as such, and now we will just need to modify all these fields accordingly. And similarly, for this, we can now reference the receiver's form and change the name accordingly. So now that we have both of these fields here, we can now change these tools to suit our requirements. Now for the proposer's side of the tokens, I'll need to make some changes in here. We'll be reusing the Hedera Send Transaction tool. All these configurations remain the same. The only difference is, for the form, we'll be selecting the proposer swap token. Now, for the payment type, this time we'll change it to fungible tokens. So first of all, I'm going to need the token ID that the proposer is trying to send, so I'm going to reference this. And the receiver is as such, the token amount to send. And now, since Hedera tokens need to be associated before we can interact with a different party, so we'll need to perform an automatic token association. Now with this, we'll also need the receiver account mnemonic phrase that we can easily reference, so I'm going to also do that. So for the transaction ID, I will manage this a bit later. I'm just going to make the changes first, so I'm going to save my process. And now, coming back, I can now make that change very quickly. And apply the change. Okay. So since we have done this tool, now we can also easily re-reference it back again. So I'm going to take this tool and copy it and paste it so that we can just make minor modifications. So for this tool, I'll need to call it the receiver. And for the configuration, we can now just make some small, tiny changes. So for example, I'm going to now reference the receiver's end. So for this token ID, we'll now be referencing from the receiver's side. So this time, the sender will be the receiver's end that will be sending to the sender himself. So from here, we're just going to make some small changes. Okay, so now that we have made our necessary changes here. Finally, we also want to store the transaction ID, and that should be it. There we go. Now, since we want to surface the transaction IDs to the front end so we can inspect it later on, what we want to do now is we'll just want to add one final tool. And for the mapping, I'm going to use the update form data tool. And in here, it doesn't matter which form we choose since they are reusing the same table names. So I'm going to save their transaction IDs respectively. And reference it via the workflow variables. So I'm going to use the property assistant. And this I'm going to reference the proposers. And this for the receiver. Okay, so that's all we need right now. And click Save. Now for the final step, I'm going to come back to the App Studio and edit our UI. We'll just need to drag in a run process component in here and reference our token swap process and apply the change. And not to forget, since this is indeed a process involving multiple parties, we would want to drag in an inbox so we can directly interact as the receiver also. Okay, so once we have done this, we can now save our UI and try the token swap out by launching the application. I'm going to click swap tokens. Now for the sender, I can always act as one party. So just as a few prerequisites, of course we'll need two persons in here to act as the sender and the receiver. For the tokens, we'll need at least 2 tokens to interact with from both parties. So each party needs 1 token to interact. So once we have this in place, we can now swap tokens. So as the sender, I'll just select any wanted users. And this person will act as the receiver. So for the proposed token, I'm going to swap this specific token. And let's say I'm going to swap about 5 tokens. I'll click submit. Now to make the demo easier, I will also now act as the receiver. You can see the task in the inbox. So I'm going to click on it. And me as the receiver, I can now select my own token that I wish to swap and add my own custom amount. So with that, now I can click complete, and upon doing this, it's going to perform the token swaps. And we should see both tokens being swapped with each other. So now that the swap has been complete, I can now click edit. We can see we have a transaction ID. So we can now verify that on Hashscan. So this is from the sender's end. We can see that the sender has indeed sent 5 of his own tokens. And how about the receiver? So we can also see that the receiver has indeed performed a transaction. And if we verify it on an explorer, we can also see now the receiver has indeed sent 4 of his own tokens to the proposer.